In February 2010, the body of 31-year-old Jason Riker was discovered in his cell at a medium-security prison in Columbus, Ohio. An investigation uncovered the shocking secret affair between Jason and 38-year-old prison guard Sarah Holloway. In August 2009, inside the walls of the facility, a series of events unfolded that would spiral into obsession, manipulation, and ultimately, murder. The night of February 13th, 2010, began like any other in the medium-security prison in Columbus, Ohio. The air inside the facility was heavy with the usual tension that lingered between the inmates and guards. Sarah Holloway, who had taken the night shift, carried out her rounds as she always did. Her colleagues barely noticed the subtle strain in her demeanor, masked by the disciplined professionalism she had perfected over her 12 years of service. But inside, Sarah was unraveling, caught in a storm of emotions she couldn't control. Jason Riker, an inmate in Block C, had become a significant part of Sarah's life over the past few months. At 9:45 p.m., during her routine cell checks, she passed his door as she always did. There was nothing unusual on the surface, just the usual glance exchanged between them. But for Sarah, these fleeting moments had taken on a dangerous meaning. Jason was her escape from the monotony of her life, from the crushing loneliness that had become her constant companion. What started as harmless conversations had evolved into something far more dangerous, a secret affair that now dictated her every thought. Jason, however, had different intentions. For him, the affair was a calculated move. He had recognized Sarah's vulnerability early on and seized the opportunity. Through coded notes and whispered exchanges, Jason had slowly built her trust, weaving a web of manipulation that he knew she couldn't escape. By 11:30 p.m., Sarah was back in the staff quarters, sipping on a cup of coffee and preparing for another sweep of the block. It was then that she received a note, slipped discreetly through the corridor by an inmate acting on Jason's orders. The message was short, but urgent. Jason claimed he was in danger, that another inmate had threatened his life. He begged her to come to his cell after lights out. The words were written with a shaky hand, adding to the urgency. Sarah's heart pounded as she read the note, her mind racing with fear for Jason's safety. She didn't question the validity of his claim. She didn't stop to think about the risks involved. All she could focus on was the man she believed she had come to care for. By 12:15 a.m., Sarah had made up her mind. She disabled the hallway camera near Jason's cell, a move she had practiced before during their secret meetings. The prison was eerily quiet as she approached his door, her footsteps echoing faintly against the cold concrete floors. When she unlocked the cell and stepped inside, Jason was waiting for her. His expression was calm, too calm for someone who had just claimed to be in danger. Sarah immediately noticed the tension in his posture, the way he stood with his back against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Jason wasted no time. He revealed his true intentions without hesitation, laying out his ultimatum like a predator cornering its prey. Help him escape, he demanded, or he would expose their affair to the prison authorities. He spoke with calculated precision, listing every piece of evidence he had collected. Letters, notes, and even an item Sarah had once smuggled into the block for him. The coldness in his voice made it clear he wasn't bluffing. Sarah was stunned. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, She felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, crushing the fragile trust she had built around their relationship. She tried to reason with him, her voice trembling with desperation. But Jason wasn't interested in reasoning. For him, this was a transaction, and Sarah was nothing more than a means to an end. As the confrontation escalated, Jason took a step closer to her, his demeanor turning menacing. His eyes, once so warm and inviting, now bore into her with a chilling detachment. He reached under his mattress and pulled out a makeshift shiv, a piece of sharpened metal wrapped in cloth for grip. He didn't intend to harm her. It was a prop to reinforce his threat. But to Sarah, it was the final push that sent her over the edge. The world seemed to blur around her. Fear, betrayal, and anger surged through her veins, drowning out all rational thought. In the heat of the moment, Sarah lunged at Jason. A struggle ensued, chaotic and desperate. Jason, caught off guard, dropped the shiv, and it clattered to the floor. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed it. Her hands trembled as she gripped the cold metal, her vision narrowing to the man in front of her, the man who had used her, manipulated her, and now threatened to destroy everything she had left. At 12:37 a.m., Sarah acted. In one swift, impulsive motion, she plunged the shiv into Jason's chest. The first strike was fueled by panic, the second by anger, and the third by a twisted mix of both. She wasn't counting. She wasn't thinking. All she knew was that she had to stop him. When it was over, Sarah stumbled back, the shiv slipping from her bloodied hands onto the floor. Jason's body crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The cell was silent except for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. She stared at what she had done, her mind unable to process the reality of it. For a brief moment, she thought about calling for help, about trying to save him. But the damage was already done. Jason was gone. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah began to clean the scene, wiping down surfaces and arranging Jason's body to make it look like an attack by another inmate. She placed the shiv near his hand, hoping to create the illusion of a fight gone wrong. By 1:15 a.m., she slipped out of the cell and reactivated the hallway camera, her movements mechanical and devoid of thought. But no matter how carefully she tried to cover her tracks, Sarah knew the truth would eventually come to light. The bond that had once brought her solace had now destroyed her, leaving her trapped in a web of her own making. As she walked back to the staff quarters, the weight of her actions settled over her like a suffocating blanket. It was only a matter of time before the world she had fought so hard to hold together came crashing down. On the morning of February 14th, 2010, the prison was still waking up when the grisly discovery of Jason Riker's body set off a chain of events that would unravel a story far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. The initial response team, led by detectives Mark Talbot and Elena Grayson, arrived at the scene just before 9 a.m. Jason's cell was sealed off, and the stark details of the crime scene immediately struck them. His body lay on the cold floor, his chest riddled with stab wounds, the blood beginning to congeal in dark pools around him. The weapon, a makeshift shiv, lay beside him, but something about its placement felt off, too deliberate, too staged. At first glance, it seemed like an act of gang violence, a fight taken too far. But as Talbot and Grayson examined the scene more closely, small details began to raise doubts. Jason's personal belongings were undisturbed. His bed, books, and few personal items remained neatly arranged, untouched by the chaos of the attack. There were no signs of forced entry into the cell, a detail that nagged at both detectives. For a crime of this magnitude, the scene was strangely silent, devoid of the mess and upheaval that usually accompanied such brutality. By February 15th, 2010, the detectives began their first round of interviews with the prison staff. Sarah Holloway's name came up repeatedly, but not in the way one might expect. Her colleagues described her as reliable, someone who followed the rules, but in recent weeks, they had noticed a shift in her demeanor. Some mentioned her sudden mood swings, the way she would sometimes seem distracted, even nervous. Others noted unexplained absences from her post during critical times. One guard recalled seeing Sarah deactivate the hallway camera near Jason's cell on the night of the murder, a detail that quickly made its way into the official report. The turning point came on February 16th, 2010, when the surveillance footage from the cell block was reviewed. The feed showed Sarah entering Jason's cell at 12:15 a.m., long after lights out, and remaining there for over 20 minutes. Her actions were precise and deliberate, not those of someone acting out of fear or in a moment of chaos. This revelation shifted the focus of the investigation. Sarah, the seemingly dutiful prison guard, became a person of interest. By February 18th, 2010, a search of Jason's belongings revealed the first concrete link between him and Sarah. Hidden in a hollowed-out book found beneath Jason's mattress was a collection of letters, handwritten, intimate, and unmistakably from Sarah. Each letter detailed their clandestine meetings, her feelings of loneliness, and her longing for a connection outside the confines of her structured life. Jason's responses, scrawled in the margins, were colder, calculated, often steering the conversation toward his plans for freedom. The discovery painted a picture of an affair steeped in manipulation and desperation. The evidence continued to pile up. Phone call logs showed that Sarah and Jason had been in contact using the prison's monitored lines, speaking in coded language to conceal the nature of their relationship. Forensic experts found traces of Sarah's DNA on Jason's bed frame, further solidifying the connection between the two. The investigation team began to reconstruct the events leading up to the murder, and the emerging picture was one of a woman pushed to her breaking point. On February 20th, 2010, Sarah was brought in for questioning. At first, she maintained her innocence, presenting herself as a professional who had only been doing her job. But as the detectives laid out the evidence, the surveillance footage, the letters, the phone records, her composure began to crack. It wasn't long before she admitted to the affair, her voice trembling as she described how Jason had manipulated her into believing he cared for her. She insisted that she had acted in self-defense, claiming that Jason had attacked her when she refused to help him escape. The self-defense argument was compelling, but fragile. By February 25th, 2010, forensic analysis of Jason's cell revealed a chilling detail that weakened Sarah's claims. Beneath a loose floor tile, investigators found a detailed escape plan, complete with notes on guard rotations, blind spots in the security system, and even sketches of the prison layout. The handwriting matched both Jason's and Sarah's, a damning piece of evidence that suggested collaboration rather than coercion. The discovery cast doubt on Sarah's narrative, painting her not as a victim, but as a willing accomplice in Jason's scheme. As the investigation deepened, another shocking revelation emerged. A fellow guard, Thomas Reed, came forward with information that added yet another layer to the case. Reed, who had worked alongside Sarah for years, admitted to tipping off the warden about her suspicious behavior. Reed confessed that he had harbored feelings for Sarah and had become increasingly jealous of her interactions with Jason. Though he claimed his intentions were noble, his admission highlighted the complicated web of emotions and motivations that surrounded the case. By the end of February 2010, the detectives had built a compelling case against Sarah. The evidence pointed not to a moment of self-defense, but to a premeditated act born out of fear, desperation, and betrayal. For Sarah, the lines between victim and perpetrator had blurred, leaving her to face the consequences of a relationship that had spiraled out of control. The investigation, meticulous and unrelenting, revealed not just the truth about Jason's murder, but the dark undercurrents of manipulation and obsession that had led to it. The months leading up to Sarah Holloway's trial, in October 2010, were a time of unrelenting emotional torment. Alone in her holding cell, Sarah had nothing but time to think. The weight of her actions pressed down on her with every passing hour, but it wasn't the murder itself that haunted her the most. It was the faces of her two children, Matthew and Aaron. They were her world, the reason she had endured years of hardship and loneliness. Now they were forced to live with the shame of her choices. Sarah couldn't stop wondering how her son and daughter were coping, imagining their confusion, their pain, and the questions they must have been too afraid to ask. Flashbacks plagued her nights, vivid memories of the first few times she interacted with Jason Riker. It had started so simply, just short conversations during her rounds. Jason had a way of making her feel seen, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. He listened, or at least he pretended to, as she shared small bits of her life. She told herself it was harmless, even when she began looking forward to those moments more than anything else in her day. But now, as Sarah sat in the silence of her cell, those memories brought nothing but shame. She saw clearly how vulnerable she had been, how her desperate need for validation had left her blind to Jason's true nature. As the trial approached, the prosecution began building their case, and Jason's manipulative personality took center stage. Inmates who had known him came forward with chilling accounts of his behavior. They described him as a man who thrived on control, someone who could read a person's weaknesses and exploit them without hesitation. Several inmates testified that Jason had bragged about his ability to manipulate Sarah, referring to her as a pawn in his larger plan to escape. One inmate recounted overhearing Jason boast about how easy it had been to win her over, calling it a game he had perfected during his time in prison. The prosecution painted a damning picture, not only of Jason's character, but also of Sarah's complicity. They highlighted her role in deactivating cameras, sneaking in contraband, and even drafting parts of Jason's escape plan. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet Sarah's defense team worked tirelessly to shift the narrative. They focused on the psychological toll of Jason's manipulation, presenting Sarah as a victim trapped in an abusive dynamic. Meanwhile, Sarah's children, Matthew, 16, and Aaron, 14, were thrust into the media spotlight. Reporters camped outside their school, eager for any glimpse of the family. Both children struggled to reconcile the loving mother they knew with the person now being accused of murder. Matthew, once a confident and outgoing teenager, withdrew from his friends and stopped participating in school sports. Erin, who had always idolized her mother, began acting out, skipping classes, and lashing out at teachers. Their father, who had been absent for most of their lives, returned to take temporary custody, but his presence did little to comfort them. The siblings clung to each other, trying to make sense of a world that had been upended. By the time October 11th, 2010 arrived, the trial had captivated the nation. Sarah was dubbed the seductive guard by the media, a title that both sensationalized and distorted the truth of her story. Cameras flashed incessantly as she was escorted into the courthouse, her face pale but composed. Inside, the courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation as the prosecution began their opening statements. The trial was a battle of narratives. The prosecution depicted Sarah as a predator who had abused her authority for personal gain. They described her actions as calculated, citing the evidence of her role in Jason's escape plan as proof of premeditation. They argued that the murder was not an act of self-defense, but a desperate attempt to silence Jason before he could expose their affair. On the other hand, the defense sought to humanize Sarah, emphasizing her struggles as a single mother and the psychological manipulation she endured. They brought in a forensic psychologist who testified about the power dynamics between guards and inmates, explaining how Jason had likely preyed on Sarah's vulnerabilities. The defense team argued that Sarah's actions, while tragic, were not those of a cold-blooded killer, but of a woman pushed to the brink. Witness testimonies added layers of complexity to the case. Sarah's colleagues, though reluctant, admitted to noticing her unusual behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. Some described her as distracted, while others mentioned her uncharacteristic absences from her post. These accounts, combined with the surveillance footage and forensic evidence, painted a picture of a woman caught in a dangerous spiral. Yet, the most emotionally charged moments came when Matthew and Erin were called to testify. The courtroom fell silent as Matthew described his mother's sacrifices, how she had worked double shifts to provide for them after their father left. His voice cracked as he spoke about the woman he believed in, the mother who had been his rock. Erin, too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, spoke haltingly about how much she missed her mother. Their words brought many in the courtroom to tears, including members of the jury. As the trial progressed, Sarah's own guilt became increasingly evident. She struggled to meet the eyes of her children when they took the stand, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like a physical burden. By the time the closing arguments began on October 29th, 2010, Sarah had come to accept that she might never regain their trust, a realization that broke her more than the prospect of a prison sentence ever could. In the end, the courtroom became a stage for two competing stories, one of betrayal and manipulation, the other of desperation and vulnerability. The jury was left to decide which version of Sarah Holloway they believed: the guard who had abused her power, or the woman who had been consumed by her own need to be loved. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, but for Sarah, the verdict would mark the beginning of a lifetime of reckoning. The courtroom was silent on the morning of October 12, 2011, as the jury filed in to deliver their verdict. Sarah Holloway, wearing a simple blouse and slacks, sat motionless at the defense table. Her hands trembled slightly, resting in her lap, but her face was calm, resigned. The months leading up to this moment had drained her of nearly everything: her energy, her hope, and her connection to the world outside. The weight of the verdict wasn't just about the years she might face behind bars. It was about the confirmation of everything she had lost. When the foreperson read the words "guilty of second-degree murder," there was no gasp from the gallery, no dramatic collapse on Sarah's part. Instead, there was a kind of stillness, as though time itself had paused to acknowledge the gravity of what had just occurred. Sarah nodded faintly, as though she had expected no other outcome. Behind her, she could hear muffled sobs from her teenage daughter, Erin, who clung tightly to her older brother, Matthew. Their father sat stiffly beside them, his face a mask of indifference. The sentencing, announced later that afternoon, added to the finality of it all: 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. Sarah's face remained expressionless as the judge delivered the sentence, but inside, a torrent of emotions raged. Regret, shame, and a strange sense of relief all collided. The fight was over, and now she would have to live with the consequences. On October 25, 2011, Sarah was transferred to the Ohio Reformatory for Women. The ride to the facility was quiet, the sound of the tires on the highway the only noise breaking the silence. Sarah stared out the window, watching the world she once knew slip further away. She thought of her children, now living with their father in another state. She wondered if they would visit her, or if the shame of her actions would eventually create a distance too wide to bridge. She tried not to think about how much older they would be when she was finally released, how much of their lives she would miss. Inside the prison, Sarah was stripped of her former identity. She became just another inmate, assigned a number and a cell. The routine was grueling, but in some ways, it brought her a strange sense of relief. There was no room for introspection in the tightly controlled schedule, no time to dwell on what she had lost. But at night, when the lights dimmed and the facility grew quiet, the memories would return. She would think of Jason, of the way he had smiled at her during those first conversations, and of how that smile had hidden so much darkness. She would think of her children, of the life she had worked so hard to build for them, now shattered beyond repair. The world outside moved on, but Sarah's story remained a cautionary tale. Advocacy groups continued to use her case to push for prison reform, while the media occasionally revisited her story in lurid retrospectives. For Sarah, however, the outside world was no longer a place she belonged. Her days were filled with mundane tasks and quiet moments of reflection, and her nights were haunted by the memories of a life she could never return to. Sarah's final words to the journalist, spoken during that last interview, echoed in the minds of those who had followed her story. "I wanted to feel alive. Instead, I lost everything." It was a sentiment that captured the tragic irony of her journey, a search for connection and meaning that had led only to loss and regret. For those who knew her, it was a reminder of the fragility of human choices and the devastating consequences that could follow a single moment of weakness. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss our updates. If you thought this case was shocking, you won't believe. The wife who buried her husband in the backyard and married another man on his grave. Check it out now and share your thoughts in the comments.